Hello and welcome to the Marketing Times Analytics podcast. I'm your host, Alex Safranis, and today I'm on with Soňa Kľučárová. Soňa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me on the podcast. My name is Soňa, and I'm originally from Slovakia, which is a tiny country in the middle of Europe. I went to college in Vienna, Austria, where I lived for about 8 years. After college, I also worked for 2 years in project management. And then I decided to sort of change careers and I moved to the United States, to Orlando, Florida, where I completed my PhD in business administration with a specialization in marketing. Um, and then after that, I worked for 2 years as a postdoc at Montpellier Business School in France. And after that, I moved back to the United States and I currently work as an assistant professor of marketing at the University of Nebraska at Omaha.
Nice. So what did you write your dissertation on for your PhD?
So my dissertation was focused on status consumption. Namely, it was called Antecedents and Consequences of Status Consumption.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. So my dissertation consisted of 2 essays. So in my first essay, I was looking at the connection between people's engagement in status consumption and their propensity to engage in charitable donation behavior. And although we might be tempted to think that those are two opposing ends, we actually found, together with my advisor, that once you engage in status consumption, it actually empowers you. And then, as a consequence of that, you are more likely to engage in charitable donation behavior. So that was my first essay. And then my second essay is about word of mouth, about status products. So again, people are very tempted to talk and share word of mouth about their status products. So if you think about um, luxury handbags or like brand name clothes and stuff like that, and they do so because they think that engagement in this word of mouth about their status product will bring them heightened status in the eyes of other people. But what we found in the second essay of my dissertation, that is actually the opposite. So if you talk about your luxury handbag, for example, people will perceive that you have lower status, in comparison to you being quiet about that status product, right? So basically, the outcome of it is that it's okay to own status products by all means, but you should not be talking about them.
Interesting. And how did you gather the data for this analysis?
So I am an experimental researcher, and so I gather my own data for all of my research. So I run experiments with my own participants, and I recruit participants online through platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk, Prolific, for example, but also at my university. So, for example, at the University of Central Florida, where I completed my PhD, we had a behavioral lab where we could run experiments with students, and it is the same at my current university, at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I also sometimes do field experiments. I recently published a paper that features an interesting field experiment that I conducted in a restaurant here in Slovakia, where I am from, and that was pretty cool.
Very cool. So can you walk us through what does that actually look like? Can you give us an example of when you ran an experiment, when you were collecting data, and what did you actually do?
So the field experiment that I ran in a restaurant, what we did was that we manipulated the conspicuousness of the plates that the restaurant uses. And by doing that, we actually manipulated the conspicuousness of the consumption, because our main focus was the manipulation of whether the consumption was conspicuous or inconspicuous. Now, just to explain, conspicuous consumption means, like more fancy, opulent, visible consumption, right? And inconspicuous consumption, is basically less visible. So in our restaurant study, we did that through the plates. So in one condition, what I call condition, we did that in the first week. So basically Monday through Friday, all the meals in the restaurant were served using very fancy plates with like gold color, and like very elaborate. So that when people, were eating their meals from those plates, they were literally conspicuously consuming. And then in the following week, everything was kept the same in the restaurant except for the plates. So all the meals in the restaurant were served using very plain, white, inconspicuous plates. And what we were looking at was whether, that the change in plates, or in other words, those plates were our proxy for conspicuous consumption, whether conspicuous versus inconspicuous consumption would have an effect on the payment method that people were using in the restaurant. And, we did that experiment in a small family-owned restaurant in Slovakia that really wants people to pay in cash. That's kind of their preference for many different reasons. And it's not the case only in Slovakia. I know that many such restaurants also in other countries prefer if the customers pay in cash. And so what we found in our experiment was that in the week that we used the conspicuous plates, or when the customers engage in conspicuous consumption, customers were more likely to pay using cash. So the outcome for the restaurant is like, if you want to increase the number of customers who pay using cash, then you might go with fancy plates and let your customers engage in conspicuous consumption, as opposed to using just plain white inconspicuous plates.
It's very interesting. Do you have a theory on why that might have an effect on how customers pay?
Mm-hmm. So we did not test that in this field study because we could only see, the outcome or the main effect. But we do propose a few theories that could actually, be at play there. One of them could be the visibility, because the main aspect of conspicuous consumption, as the name suggests, is visibility, right? And then when you look at cash as a payment method, it is also visible, especially when you compare it to paying by credit card or debit card, where you don't see the actual money, right? I mean, of course, the money is there, but you don't see it. It's just a piece of plastic. So definitely, when you look at cash versus card, cash is a more visible payment method. So we were thinking that maybe those two things are in sync. So conspicuous consumption and cash, as basically two visible things, and maybe that's what drives the effect. Our other theory was empowerment, because prior research shows that status consumption or conspicuous consumption can empower consumers. Actually, when I say prior research, it is my research, my first dissertation essay that in the meanwhile has been published, where we show that such consumption can empower consumers. And again, some other prior research shows that there might be a link between empowerment and the use of cash. So that could be another potential explanation, but we did not test that empirically. So, these are just some sort of hypotheses, but it would need to be tested empirically to be able to conclude, what is really happening there.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, and that's just a couple of the studies you've run. If I remember correctly, you've had several publications that you've created. Are there any others that you find particularly interesting that you'd like to share with us?
Sure, absolutely. So I had one publication So it was a research project that I worked on by myself during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was about and how this use of face masks can actually help increase the credibility of social media influencers and perceived competence of social media influencers, which is something that they often struggle with because there is research showing that social media influencers are often perceived as relatively incompetent. And I found that by using face masks during the pandemic, in their social media posts can actually increase their perceived competence. And the reason why it was interesting, because before the pandemic, for a very long time, who were the people who would be using face masks? Mainly medical staff, right? So medical doctors, nurses, and those kinds of people, right? And so in consumers' minds, face masks for a long time, especially before the pandemic and right at the beginning of the pandemic, were associated with those medical professionals. And those medical professionals, of course, are perceived by people as highly competent. So when a social media influencer would wear that mask, and I was testing it specifically with surgical masks, so like reusable face masks, then the people would be reminded of those medical professionals and their competence, and that competence would then rub off on the social media influencers, and that was the explanation.
Oh, I love it. That's
Thank
so
you.
interesting.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention that this research was even included in the World Health Organization's database of COVID-19 research.
Interesting. And how did you gather the data on how people rated influencers as competent?
Mhm. So again, that was an experiment that I ran online. Of course, I had to run it online. It was during the pandemic, so there were no in-person experiments at that time. And they would be randomly assigned to one of the two conditions. So they would either see an influencer who was wearing a face mask or not. And there was also a brief description of the influencer, like where the influencer is from, like what their age is, things like that. And then I used a measure of competence from the existing literature, right? So there were certain items, that the participants would have to rate using an established scale, an established competence scale.
So you put like Kim Kardashian as a 0 and like some celebrity doctor as a 10 or so. How did you establish a baseline out of curiosity?
I think there were three or so items, and I used bipolar scale for that. So basically, they were asked. So on this scale, how would you rate this influencer? And it was I believe a 7-point scale. So on the one hand, you would have incompetent. On the other hand, you would have competent, and anything in between. And a couple of other measures that I cannot remember from the top of my head. That were basically synonyms of being competent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are the sort of skills that we use, which are typically from the literature, academic
That's
literature.
that's very interesting. Um, I'm curious how that can apply to different signals that influencers can use. Like, I don't know, uh, walking around with some other kind of a tool that makes them, kind of similar to another competent professional. I don't know what that might be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but do you in general ever think about like how the learning can be applied to other use cases, and do you have any examples of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, I think this publication offers a good baseline for some potential spin-off projects, either for me or for other researchers in the field. So once we know what we know, like the effect that I established, I think other researchers or potentially even myself could take it further. And instead of face masks, which are not being so used anymore, we might be thinking of some other ways of how to increase social media influencers' competence. And what you mentioned would be a good example. Maybe, if they create social media posts in which they include some highly competent individuals, maybe some scientists, or, well, of course, it depends on the specific product that they are trying to promote, right? So if they maybe include some experts, some scientists, or some highly respected people in the field, maybe, the expertise of those people could sort of rub off on the influencers. Because many consumers, have this belief of like psychological contagion, where basically there is this relationship or this association between a product and the user who uses the product. So even that theory could be further developed, or further applied in additional contexts.
That's very interesting. So I want to kind of go back to the beginning. What got you interested in studying consumer behavior?
Well, I think consumer behavior is a very interesting area because consumer mind for a long time was like a black box, so you would not know like what's going on in their mind. But now with all the research in consumer behavior, we are gaining, more and more knowledge and insights into consumer knowledge. And I think it's very exciting because all of us are consumers and we all can relate to this in one way or another. So in other words, I'm also studying perhaps my own behavior or the behavior of my friends, my family, and that's really exciting. And very often the research ideas come from my own experiences as a consumer or from my family's experiences as consumers. And I find it really exciting.
And is that where the ideas come from? Is thinking about the way that you consume and having sort of theories on what are the drivers, or how do you kind of come up with these ideas of what to test?
Right. Yes. So they often come from my own experiences. Sometimes they also come, from the literature. So when you read papers of other colleagues in the field, or maybe you attend their presentations at conferences, you put the dots together, and then you are like, oh, I have an idea related to that, but it's a little different. But you use their knowledge as a starting point, or their findings as a starting point. So that also happens. But very often, like you are at the store as a consumer, and you are wondering, about, okay, which packaging would be better? Is it the shiny one or a non-shiny one, for example? And maybe that's that. I mean, that was a very basic example, but that's how many ideas start and then
Mm-hmm.
evolve into something more complex.
So if I wanted to run a experiment and get a learning like the ones that you recommended, what would I need to do? What would I need to um, acquire, or how do you recommend somebody actually goes out and does this kind of research? Can anybody go out and do this kind of research?
Before starting any research project, I need to contact an IRB, and basically every university in the United States has one or should have one. So IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. I need to describe formally my proposed project to them, answer their questions, and then once they find it satisfactory, and once they are sure that I will not harm any participants in my research, they will give me approval, or they will say that this is exempt, because I mean, this is just a basic research where people will answer a bunch of questions, so there is no harm in it. But it has to go through the approval process first. And so once I go through the approval process with IRB, only then I can start collecting my data. And when participants decide that they want to engage in my research, of course, first I have to present them with an informed consent that they have to read, so they are informed of their rights. They know that um, they can exit out of the research anytime. They don't have to, continue if they don't feel comfortable doing so. And they also read about the other rights that they have. They have to consent to the research, and only then can they start completing the study. And as I said before, I usually complete the studies either online. In that case, we tend to pay participants, and or we also complete some studies at the university because we have a behavioral lab, and in that case they tend to receive credits that they can then use for their courses.
Oh, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like a budget through which you operate.
Yes, I do.
And is that the primary reason you have to go through the IRB, or can you not really be introduced into a publication if you don't go through the IRB? Like what is the reason why you need to go through this process?
Mm-hmm. So the main reason why IRB exists is to protect the rights of the study participants. Because there were some cases in the past, it was like in the 50s, in the 60s, where some researchers really engaged participants in pretty harmful studies. And at the time, IRB did not exist, right? So they did not seek anybody's approval, but they caused some serious psychological harm um, to their participants. I think one good example would be the Stanford Prison Experiment by Philip Zimbardo. You might be familiar with that. Another one was by Stanley Milgram, where participants were asked to administer electric shock to other participants, right? Although these people were actors and there were no electric shocks in reality, but the participants were not aware of it. And they were basically encouraged, to keep increasing the voltage, and like the person standing next to them would be like, oh, go on, continue, keep increasing it. And so of course that caused a lot of psychological harm to these participants. So because of studies like this, there was a need for IRB. And so IRB really reviews, all the application it receives, and it makes sure that something like this will not happen again.
Does a lot of research happen outside of the university system, or is it very like, or is almost all of it through universities?
There is also this other option where you can essentially buy data sets. So data that are already there, but in that case, you are not working with primary data; you are working with secondary data. So you can basically pay company such as Nielsen to buy their data set, and then you just analyze, the data that you get from them. So in that case, of course, there is no IRB involved. I mean, you just need to have enough budget, enough money to buy those data sets. But I'm not somebody who would do that. I have colleagues who do it, but my specialization is in collecting primary data and working with primary data and conducting my own experiments.
I want to talk about one thing you mentioned in our previous call, which is around disabled social influencers. Can you tell us about your research in that area?
Sure, absolutely. So this is still very much work in progress. So I presented that research at a couple of conferences, and hopefully the next step will be, publication in some journal. Although as I mentioned, I'm still working on it, so it's not complete yet. Um, I thought it was important to start digging deeper into this topic because there is not a whole lot of academic research on disabled social media influencers, even though, as we might all be aware, there are a number of disabled social media influencers out there. And there are also several articles in popular media talking about these influencers. There are certain blogs online talking about those disabled social media influencers, but I did not find a whole lot of academic work on the topic, which I think is a pity because disabled social media influencers certainly can bring a lot of value to the companies. And I'm trying to, with my research, I'm trying to find those different ways in which disabled social media influencers could be helpful, and why companies should work with them. So in my specific project, the first project that I'm working on this topic, I'm looking at the link between disabled social media influencers and perceptions of product luxury. So in other words, I'm looking at if a product is promoted by a disabled influencer versus a non-disabled influencer, how will that affect consumers' perceptions that this product is luxurious? And interestingly, I find that if a product is promoted by a disabled influencer, consumers have the perception that this product is more luxurious, which I think could be very beneficial, especially for companies that are in the luxury sector and that want to promote their products as luxurious, and that want to create the perception that their products are luxurious.
Wow. That's interesting. So that'll be coming out soon, I guess. People can follow you for how that turns out. Any other interesting research that you're doing, or any other results you'd like to share?
I have this other project with one colleague from my previous school, so Montpellier Business School, where we are looking at minimalism in product design, which is also a very hot topic these days. Like minimalism and inconspicuousness. Um, and so that's also a pretty cool topic because there are so many products these days that look very, very minimalistic. And if you or I look at them, we would think that they maybe cost a couple of dollars, but then in reality, they might end up costing hundreds or thousands of dollars, right? And my colleague and I were really intrigued by this. And we were wondering, okay, are people really willing to pay a lot of money for these minimalistic products or not? And furthermore, what do they think that other people are willing to pay for these products? So what is their perception or their prediction of how much these products are valued by other people? Um, so that was one question, and the other question was, can these minimalistic products' perceived value be increased if we attach some sort of high status cue to them, right? So if, for example, there is a piece of information stating that this product was designed by a well-known designer, will that increase the perceived value of that product, and also the perceived value that we think other people will have of that product? So these are the sort of questions that we are currently exploring with regard to that specific project. And again, I think there will be many other projects, and there are already many other research projects, by different scholars in marketing who are looking into those minimalistic product designs, and especially luxurious minimalistic product designs.
Very interesting. I remember just seeing on social media, people contrasting how even architecture was done 100 years ago or 200 years ago compared to today. And we see this minimalism everywhere. Everything has been simplified. And I certainly hope that we go back to a more ornate design language as a society, because it's kind of sad to see the art stripped away. So I'm
Mhm.
curious what comes of that study.
Oh, like with that study, what we found, and we are focusing specifically on the minimalistic products because we even try to run some experiments with the ornate products, or more elaborate ones, and we don't find the same effect. So the effect was basically flat for more maximalistic product. But for the minimalistic products, we find that adding a high status cue, such as mentioning that it was designed by an established designer, can actually increase the perceived value of that minimalistic product. And more specifically, it also increases what we call the second order willingness to pay, meaning people assume that if you put or if you attach some high status hue to a minimalistic product, they assume that especially other people will be willing to pay more for that product. And it can be used, of course, by some luxury retailers. First of all, they can attach some high status cues to their minimalistic products if they want to increase consumers' valuation of those products. And second of all, they can try to put consumers into the shoes of other people, so that consumers will not think as themselves, but they will try to put themselves into the shoes of other people, because by doing that they can increase their willingness to pay even further.
Wow. That's very interesting. It's crazy to think like all of this can be studied and optimized. It can inform product design. And I guess have you worked with any companies, or have you seen your work actually impact the products that a company releases?
Not yet. I haven't seen that yet, but I certainly hope that my research will inform some companies and their products. And not only companies and their products, but even like nonprofits, who are trying, for example, to raise as much money as possible for their charitable causes. So, in other words, I'm hopeful that my research can be put into good use in that regard as well. I have one research project that got published back in 2018, where we are specifically looking at advertising appeals and how they affect the donation intention of consumers. And we manipulate two things. So the first is you get an email, for example, with the donation appeal, and you will see the picture of the victim there. And we manipulate whether the victim is happy, smiling, or whether the victim is sad. And the second thing we manipulated in that research was the text underneath. So, in our technical language, we call it regulatory focus, whether it's promotion or prevention. I think in layman terms, promotion is like a more positive, upbeat language, which is focused on gains, and prevention focus is more on like how to avoid losses. So it's kind of like more negative. And what we find in that research is that the combination of a happy victim image with the promotion focused text, so like a more positive text focused on gains, is the most effective in driving up charitable donations. So I'm really hopeful that more and more charities will start using that, because we see many charities that are using sad appeals and like pictures of sad victims, but in our research we did not find those images to be very effective in driving up charitable donations. So really what we found was that the ideal combination would be a happy victim image combined with that promotion focused text.
Very interesting. I love that, and hopefully some businesses are listening to this and can learn
Yes.
from it, and it can be implemented. So, thank you, Sonia. I think that's a great ending point. I really appreciate you joining for this episode.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely, and I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Thank you.
Alrighty, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you soon.